So we're on the buses at the moment on BBC Essex Breakfast. Ian in for Sonia. As I mentioned, Chris Todd is director of the Transport Action Network and was listening to my conversation with Jean about her particular issues with the number 21. Chris, is this something that's happening right across the country, are you seeing? Good morning.
Good morning, Ian. Yes, I think unfortunately what both Jean and Steve have highlighted is happening everywhere. We've seen huge cuts in public transport because it's not just the buses that have had their frequencies slashed, but it's also the rail services as well. And the upshot is people are being denied the ability to get around. It's clogging up our cities and towns with more and more cars as people are forced into the car. And as Jean has highlighted, and Steve, it's bad for the environment as well.
It's a bit of a catch-22, it seems, and Jean sort of was talking about this. If the regular buses aren't there, people don't use them. But if people don't use them, the services aren't there. It's how do we kind of sort this catch-22 out?
Well, I think we need to, have a complete reset when we think about public transport. I mean, the clue's in the name, really. It's for the public. It should be a public service. Other countries manage it, such as Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, many of them far less densely populated than we are in the UK. Yet they manage to provide services that enable people to live fulfilling lives, even when they're relatively small populations. And the question is, why can't we do it in this country? And part of the reason is the obsession with having to privatise everything. It's not being run for the public good. If it was, then you'd have the proper frequencies in the proper locations, delivering services people want. And part of the problem is, a few years ago, we had a promise of £3 billion to improve bus services across the country. Now, with COVID, things went haywire. The Treasury has now clawed back a lot of that money, saying the buses had it as part of the COVID support mechanism. So places like Southend, which had quite ambitious plans to improve the bus services, has been left high and dry and not able to implement them. And if it had done, that would have made a big difference. And just to sort of set that in contrast to what's happening on road building, in Essex, you've got the Lower Thames Crossing potentially coming, a £10 billion project. They can find money for a £10 billion project, which is actually going to make congestion worse over the bigger area, and it can't be used by public transport. Whereas they can't find the millions that are needed to actually make people's lives bearable and livable through properly investing in local bus services.
But those millions would still need to come through subsidy then, which would mean coming through taxes, which, as we know, are already under demand, not least, as you mentioned, because of COVID and the bills that we have to pay off because of that.
Well, I think that is right. The money has to come from somewhere, but the point is there's £10 billion potentially going into a road project, which is more of a vanity project because it's not going to relieve congestion at Dartford as being talked about.
Well, I think we'll leave the lower crossing.
It's an important point.
I take your point. You're saying money is going into some things, and you'd like to see more of that money going into public transport. But how would we encourage people to use it, Chris? Because would they? I mean, if we put all this money in and had buses running, all day and night, would there be people on it? I still see quite a few empty buses running around, to be honest, where I am.
Yeah, I think if you did it overnight, you'd probably have a lot of empty buses because people wouldn't necessarily know about them. I think the point is, as Jean was saying, is that people don't know about these services. So it's a combined thing. And part of the plan that Southend had was, for example, wasn't just about better services. It was also about cheaper services, but it was also about a program of investment in terms of publicity and telling people how you could use the bus services and where you could get to and how you could use them. And I think if you combine all of that along with better bus shelters and information at the bus stops, then you start to change people's attitude towards buses. They understand that they can actually play a part in their lives and they'll start to use them. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, I accept. But with the prioritisation of funding, you can deliver these changes and the benefits that they bring, because they also bring other wider benefits which save money in other areas.
So do you have some sympathies with the bus companies that because of COVID, I mean, for a large chunk of the last 2 or 3 years, people were told not to use public transport. And of course, people get out of the habit, I guess. And now, of course, we want people to use public transport. But do you have sympathy with some of the managers that are making these decisions and trying to make their routes pay?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there is an issue. They run a private company. They've got to have a return for shareholders. And in that context, they will have to make hard decisions. But the point is, I think, is that this setup isn't working. It hasn't worked for 20 or 30 years. So we need something different. And that's the key point.
Maybe if you're listening, would you like to suggest what we do need? Thank you, Chris Todd from Transport Action Network. The system is not working, says Chris, and hasn't done for perhaps 20 or 30 years. And Chris and Jean pointing to examples from overseas where countries, seem to, in Chris and Jean's view, maybe you have a view, run better services for less money for the paying passenger. What is the answer, do you think? What would get you on the buses? 0800 111 40 41. It'd be great to hear from you, and especially if these changes over the weekend, and there were changes back in May. I was on breakfast actually for Sonia when the last big change happened, and first actually one. Laura is in Thurrock. Hi, Laura.
Hi there, Ian. Yeah,
Hi.
I agree exactly what you're saying and what other callers have said. Chris Todd said. It makes perfect sense that if they want more people using public transport, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be affordable. And with the amount of money that's being invested in projects like the Lower Thames Crossing, 10 billion, imagine what could be done with that. And it's not just about the local buses, it's about being able to travel further afield as well. There aren't any options to easily get across to south of the river. A lot of people work over there or vice versa. There aren't the connections that we need to be able to do that. So wasting money on things like the Lower Thames Crossing, which is just going to make traffic worse and doesn't have any provision to actually allow us to use public transport, is crazy. Kennex Tram is another option for Cross River on public transport, 800 million. And that would give us cross-river access as well, and it would be more reliable and more sustainable.
We need to look at other ways because, I mean, last week I was doing the morning programme and every day we had queues of 4, 5, 6 miles at the Dartford tunnels last week. So clearly, more needs to be done. Is it realistic to think public transport would be the answer to that?
I think it is, not just public transport, but investment into more sustainable travel to get some of the freight off of the roads and onto rail. For around £4 billion, there's a rail improvement between Ashford in Kent and Reading. That would take enough freight off of the roads and onto more sustainable rail that it would free up the roads for the essential traffic that does need to use it. So a combination of that, which will also improve for passengers if you're improving rail service for freight, and Kennex Trams, and some money invested into making sure our buses are more reliable and affordable. You'd probably still have change from the 10 billion they're going to waste on the Lower Thames Crossing, which won't solve the problem. The Dartford Crossing would still be over capacity. It's a no-brainer for me.
Laura from Thurrock with her point of view. What about you? I mean, we're not specifically talking about the Lower Thames Crossing today, but it's come up in terms of money and big investment, and my guest and Laura suggesting they'd rather that money go into public transport rather than that. Perhaps you do have more hopes for what it will achieve, and you want to put the other side. More than happy to do that. 0800 111 40 41.
Ian Wyatt, BBC.